There's a case in Carl Jung's files so disturbing that he hesitated for decades before publishing it. It's the story of an empath who absorbed so much suffering from others that he completely lost his own identity, and what happened on the day he finally lost his mind will forever change how you see empathy. Imagine you can physically feel the emotional pain of everyone around you, not just understand or sympathize, but literally experience their emotions as if they were your own. Now imagine this ability has no off switch. Every person you encounter dumps their trauma, fears, and anguish directly into your nervous system. You become a living container for humanity's collective suffering. This isn't science fiction. It's the devastating reality of empaths, and Jung discovered something about extreme empathy that modern psychology still refuses to acknowledge. Picture this. You're walking through a crowded street, and suddenly you're hit by waves of emotions that aren't yours. The businessman rushing past you floods you with his anxiety about a failing marriage. The woman at the coffee shop drowns you in her grief over a recent loss. The teenager scrolling on his phone overwhelms you with his suicidal thoughts. You absorb it all, feel it all, carry it all. By the end of the day, you can't tell which emotions belong to you and which belong to the dozens of people you've encountered. This is hyperempathy, and it's destroying more people than anyone realizes. Carl Gustav Jung wasn't just fascinated by the human psyche, he was terrified by it. Throughout his career, he documented cases that pushed the boundaries of what psychology considered possible. But there was one case that haunted him more than any other, a case that revealed the dark side of humanity's most celebrated trait, empathy itself. Jung discovered that empathy isn't always a gift. Sometimes it's a curse that can literally drive you insane. The case involved a 34-year-old man, Jung, called Patient E. A teacher from Zurich who came to Jung in 1913 claiming that other people's emotions were eating him alive from the inside. Patient E described a phenomenon Jung had never encountered: the complete inability to distinguish between his own emotional state and the emotional states of everyone around him. He had become what Jung would later term a psychological sponge, absorbing and retaining emotional content from every human interaction. But Patient E wasn't just sensitive or intuitive. He exhibited what Jung documented as pathological empathy, a condition where the normal psychological boundaries that protect individual identity had completely dissolved. He could walk into a room and within minutes be overwhelmed by the collective emotional state of everyone present. He couldn't control it, couldn't filter it, couldn't protect himself from it. He had become trapped in other people's inner worlds with no way back to his own. Jung initially dismissed this as hysteria or attention-seeking behavior, but as he spent more time with Patient E, he began to witness something that challenged everything he believed about human consciousness. This man wasn't making up his experiences. He was demonstrating abilities that seemed to transcend normal psychological functioning. He could describe in detail the emotional states, traumatic memories, and unconscious conflicts of complete strangers with uncanny accuracy. The modern world has created an epidemic of hyperempathy that Jung predicted but couldn't have imagined in its full horror. Social media bombards empathic individuals with the emotional states of thousands of people simultaneously. The news cycles flood sensitive people with trauma, outrage, and suffering from around the globe. Dating apps expose empaths to the emotional wounds and desperate needs of countless strangers. The result is a generation of people who are emotionally overwhelmed, psychologically fragmented, and completely exhausted from carrying burdens that aren't even theirs. Here's the central question that will haunt you. What happens when someone's capacity for empathy becomes so extreme that it destroys their ability to function as an individual human being? Jung discovered that empathy exists on a spectrum, and at the extreme end of that spectrum lies madness. The very trait that makes us most human can, when taken too far, make us lose our humanity entirely. The dissolution of emotional boundaries is Jung's first terrifying insight into pathological empathy. Most people have natural psychological barriers that allow them to experience empathy without being consumed by it. They can feel for others while maintaining their own emotional equilibrium. But some individuals are born with these boundaries, either weakened or completely absent. Patient E described his condition as living inside everyone else's nervous system. He couldn't walk past a homeless person without being flooded with their despair. He couldn't have conversations with friends without absorbing their relationship problems, family traumas, and deepest insecurities. He couldn't even watch movies or read books without being emotionally hijacked by the characters' experiences. His own emotional landscape had been completely colonized by other people's feelings. This isn't the gentle, healing empathy that people celebrate on social media. This is empathy as psychological invasion. Imagine if you could physically feel every headache, stomachache, and injury of everyone you encountered. Now imagine the same thing happening with emotions. Every anxiety attack, every depressive episode, every moment of rage or despair becomes yours to carry. This is what Jung witnessed in patient E, and it was destroying him from the inside out. The psychological mechanism behind this phenomenon is what Jung called boundary dissolution. In healthy individuals, the ego maintains clear distinctions between self and other, internal and external, personal and collective. But in cases of extreme empathy, these boundaries become permeable or disappear entirely. The individual becomes what Jung described as a psychological medium, someone through whom other people's emotional content flows without resistance or filtration. Modern neuroscience has identified the biological basis for this condition. Studies show that individuals with hyperactive mirror neuron systems experience other people's emotions as if they were occurring in their own brains. Brain imaging reveals that extreme empaths show unusual activity in the anterior insula and anterior cingulate cortex, areas responsible for emotional processing and self-other distinction. Their brains literally can't tell the difference between their own emotional experiences and those of others. But here's what makes Jung's case so terrifying. Patient E wasn't just experiencing other people's current emotional states. He was absorbing their traumatic memories, their childhood wounds, their unconscious fears and desires. He had become what Jung called a living repository for the collective shadow, a person who unconsciously collected and stored the disowned psychological content of everyone he encountered. Take the phenomenon of emotional contagion to its absolute extreme. In normal social situations, people unconsciously mirror each other's emotional states to create connection and understanding. But patient E had lost the ability to control this process. He was in a constant state of emotional contagion with everyone around him, simultaneously experiencing the joy, sorrow, anger, and terror of dozens of people at once. Social media has created millions of digital patient EAs. Every day, empathic individuals scroll through feeds filled with other people's trauma, outrage, and emotional breakdowns. They absorb the collective anxiety of political chaos, the shared grief of global tragedies, the cumulative frustration of social injustice. They think they're staying informed or being compassionate, but they're actually drowning in emotional content that their nervous systems weren't designed to process. The psychological effect is devastating. These digital empaths report feeling constantly overwhelmed, emotionally exhausted, and unable to distinguish between their own problems and the problems of the world. They develop what researchers now call empathy fatigue, a condition where the capacity for emotional connection becomes so overloaded that it shuts down entirely. They go from feeling everything to feeling nothing, from hyperempathy to emotional numbness. Have you ever felt like you're carrying the weight of everyone else's problems? Like you can't enjoy your own happiness because you're too aware of others' suffering? Like you absorb the energy of every room you enter, every person you talk to, every piece of content you consume? That's the empathy trap that Jung identified over a century ago, and it's more relevant now than ever. Patient E described his daily experience as emotional schizophrenia. He would wake up feeling relatively normal, but within hours of human contact, he would be flooded with emotions and memories that didn't belong to him. He couldn't maintain relationships because he became too overwhelmed by his partner's emotional needs. He couldn't work effectively because he was constantly distracted by his students' and colleagues' psychological states. He couldn't even enjoy simple pleasures because he was always tuned into someone else's frequency. The psychic vampire effect became Jung's second crucial observation. Patient E wasn't just passively absorbing emotions. He was unconsciously attracting emotionally troubled people like a magnet. Wounded individuals seemed to sense his hyperempathic abilities and gravitated toward him, seeking emotional release and healing. But instead of helping them, his presence actually made their problems worse by giving them an outlet to dump their psychological content without having to process it themselves. Jung realized that patient E had become what he termed an emotional dumping ground for the collective unconscious. People would unconsciously use him as a repository for feelings they couldn't handle, experiences they couldn't integrate, and traumas they couldn't process. They would leave conversations with him feeling lighter and more balanced, while he would be left carrying their psychological burdens as if they were his own. This dynamic creates a vicious cycle that Jung called the empath's paradox. The more patient E tried to help others by absorbing their pain, the more psychologically damaged he became. And the more damaged he became, the more he attracted people who needed someone to absorb their pain. He was trapped in a pattern of psychological self-destruction disguised as compassion. Modern psychology has identified this pattern in therapists, counselors, healers, and anyone in caring professions. They call it secondary trauma or vicarious traumatization. But Jung understood it as something deeper, the inevitable result of empathy without boundaries. When you make yourself emotionally available to everyone's pain, you become a magnet for pain. When you try to heal everyone's wounds, you end up wounded yourself. Social workers, nurses, therapists, and other helping professionals show unusually high rates of depression, anxiety, and burnout. They enter their careers wanting to make a difference, to help heal the world's suffering, but many end up more psychologically damaged than the people they're trying to help. They absorb trauma from their clients, carry emotional burdens that aren't theirs, and gradually lose themselves in other people's stories of pain and dysfunction. The digital age has extended this dynamic beyond professional helpers to anyone with empathic tendencies. Social media algorithms specifically target empathic individuals because they're more likely to engage with emotional content and more likely to absorb the trauma and outrage that keeps them scrolling. Empaths become unwitting consumers of collective psychological content, carrying the emotional labor for entire online communities. Patient E began experiencing what Jung described as identity fragmentation. He would have days where he couldn't remember which experiences were his and which belonged to others. He would feel guilty about things he hadn't done, ashamed of behaviors he'd never exhibited, afraid of threats that existed only in other people's memories. His sense of self was being systematically erased by the constant influx of foreign psychological material. The emotional possession phenomenon reached its peak when patient E began manifesting physical symptoms of traumas he had never experienced. He developed chronic pain in his back after spending time with a war veteran. He experienced panic attacks that matched exactly the symptoms described by an anxious colleague. He even began showing signs of dissociation and memory loss that corresponded to the psychological patterns of abuse survivors he had encountered. Jung documented this as somatic empathy, the physical manifestation of other people's emotional and traumatic experiences. Patient E's nervous system was so overwhelmed by foreign psychological content that it began expressing that content through physical symptoms. His body was literally breaking down from carrying emotional burdens that belonged to others. This is where Jung's case becomes truly terrifying. Patient E wasn't just experiencing other people's current emotional states. He was being possessed by their traumatic memories, their unconscious patterns, their deepest psychological wounds. He had become what Jung called a medium for the collective shadow, channeling aspects of the human psyche that others couldn't face or integrate. Neuroscience now understands that trauma is stored not just in memory, but in the nervous system itself. When empaths absorb others' emotional content, they're not just taking on feelings, they're taking on the somatic imprints of experiences they never lived through. Their bodies begin to hold and express traumas that aren't theirs, creating a cascading effect of psychological and physical dysfunction. The final stage of patient E's deterioration was what Jung termed empathic psychosis, a complete break from reality caused by the inability to distinguish between self and other. He began believing that other people's memories were his own. He would describe traumatic experiences in vivid detail, convinced that he had lived through events that had actually happened to people he had encountered weeks or months earlier. Jung realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in psychiatric literature. Madness caused not by internal psychological dysfunction, but by the complete absorption of external psychological content. Patient E hadn't developed mental illness in the traditional sense. He had been psychologically colonized by the mental illnesses of others. But the most terrifying part of Jung's case wasn't patient E's gradual descent into madness. It was what happened on the specific day he finally broke. Jung documented this day in excruciating detail, and what he witnessed challenges everything we think we know about the limits of human empathy and the nature of consciousness itself. October 15, 1913. Patient E arrived at Jung's office for what would be their final session together. Jung immediately noticed something different about him. The man who had spent months describing feeling overwhelmed by others' emotions now appeared completely calm, almost serene. His usual fidgeting and nervous energy were gone, replaced by an unsettling stillness that Jung would later describe as the quiet before the psychological storm. Patient E sat down and looked directly at Jung with an expression the doctor had never seen before. Then he began to speak, but not in his own voice. Over the next 3 hours, Jung witnessed what he called the most extraordinary and terrifying display of empathic possession he had ever encountered. Patient E began channeling the distinct personalities, voices, and mannerisms of everyone he had absorbed emotional content from over the previous months. The multiplicity crisis erupted without warning. One moment patient E was speaking in the broken English of an immigrant worker he had encountered, describing in vivid detail the man's traumatic journey to Switzerland and his struggles with poverty and discrimination. The next moment he shifted into the refined accent and vocabulary of a wealthy widow, recounting her grief over losing her husband and her fears about growing old alone. But these weren't just impressions or imitations. Patient E was accessing specific memories, private details, and intimate psychological content that he could not have known through normal means. He described childhood traumas that these individuals had never spoken about publicly. He revealed secret fears, hidden desires, and unconscious patterns that Jung realized could only be known through direct psychological contact. Jung sat transfixed as patient E cycled through personality after personality, each one complete with its own emotional signature, its own way of moving and speaking, its own psychological agenda. The teacher had become a living theater for the collective unconscious, performing the inner lives of dozens of people simultaneously. This phenomenon goes far beyond multiple personality disorder or dissociative identity disorder. Those conditions involve the fragmenting of a single psyche into separate parts. What Jung witnessed was the opposite, the absorption of multiple complete psyches into a single, overwhelmed consciousness. Patient E hadn't split into different personalities. He had become a container for other people's complete personalities. Modern neuroscience has no adequate explanation for what Jung documented. While we understand how mirror neurons can cause emotional contagion and how trauma can be transmitted between individuals, the level of psychological absorption that patient E demonstrated exceeds anything in current scientific literature. He wasn't just mimicking or remembering. He was somehow accessing and expressing the complete psychological content of people he had encountered. Jung realized he was witnessing something that challenged the fundamental assumptions of individual consciousness. If patient E could access other people's memories, traumas, and psychological patterns so completely, what did that mean about the nature of human identity? Where does one person's consciousness end and another's begin? Are we truly separate individuals, or are we more interconnected at the unconscious level than we realize? The collective shadow eruption reached its peak when patient E began expressing the darkest, most violent aspects of the people he had absorbed. Jung watched in horror as this gentle teacher transformed into a series of increasingly disturbing personalities: an abusive father screaming at invisible children, a jealous lover planning revenge, a suicidal teenager contemplating self-harm. But the most chilling moment came when patient E began speaking as Jung himself. He started analyzing Jung's own psychological state, revealing the doctor's private fears, unconscious motivations, and repressed desires with surgical precision. He described Jung's relationship with his wife, his conflicts with Freud, his secret doubts about his own theories. He was accessing Jung's psychological content as easily as he had accessed everyone else's. Jung realized that patient E's empathic abilities had reached a level where he could psychically invade anyone's unconscious mind. The boundaries between individuals had completely dissolved, not just for patient E, but for anyone who came into psychological contact with him. He had become what Jung termed a black hole of consciousness, a person so psychically permeable that he pulled others into his psychological field and absorbed their entire inner worlds. This revelation terrified Jung more than anything he had encountered in his psychiatric career. If consciousness could be this permeable, if individual identity could be this fragile, then what did that mean for human free will, personal responsibility, and the nature of self? Patient E wasn't just mentally ill. He had become a living demonstration that the boundaries between minds might be much more fluid than anyone had imagined. The modern implications of Jung's discovery are staggering. In our hyper-connected world, we're all being subjected to unprecedented levels of psychological input from others. Social media, news cycles, and digital communication create constant opportunities for empathic absorption and boundary dissolution. We're all becoming partial versions of patient E, overwhelmed by psychological content that isn't ours, but affects us as if it were. Consider how social media algorithms specifically target empathic individuals with content designed to provoke emotional responses. Every piece of outrage porn, every traumatic news story, every friend's emotional breakdown shared online becomes psychological content that empaths absorb and carry. The digital age has created millions of people who are experiencing mild versions of what patient E went through: the gradual erosion of psychological boundaries through constant exposure to others' emotional states. The empathic contagion effect explains why certain individuals seem to attract chaos and dysfunction wherever they go. Like patient E, they unconsciously absorb and amplify the psychological disturbance of everyone around them. They become lightning rods for other people's unresolved trauma, unconscious conflicts, and emotional instability. Jung observed that patient E had developed what he called psychological magnetism for wounded people. Individuals with unhealed trauma, unprocessed emotions, and unconscious psychological conflicts were inexorably drawn to him. But instead of finding healing in his presence, They found temporary relief by unconsciously dumping their psychological content onto him. This created a feedback loop that Jung termed the empathy death spiral. The more psychological content patient E absorbed, the more unstable his own energy became. The more unstable his energy became, the more he attracted people who were seeking someone to absorb their instability. He had become trapped in a pattern of psychological predation disguised as healing. Modern empaths experience this same dynamic on social media. They post content about mental health, emotional wellness, or spiritual growth, which attracts followers who are seeking someone to absorb their psychological pain. These followers share their traumas, dump their emotional baggage, and seek constant validation and support. The empaths think they're helping, but they're actually being psychologically drained by people who have no intention of doing their own healing work. Jung's documentation of patient E's final breakdown reveals the ultimate danger of uncontrolled empathy. As the man cycled through dozens of absorbed personalities, Jung realized that patient E himself, his original identity, his core self, had completely disappeared. There was no longer a person there, just a collection of other people's psychological fragments held together by an increasingly fragmented consciousness. The man who had walked into Jung's office months earlier as a sensitive teacher concerned about his empathic abilities had been completely erased by those variabilities. His empathy hadn't made him more human. It had made him inhuman, a hollow vessel for other people's psychological content with no remaining sense of individual identity. This is Jung's most terrifying insight about extreme empathy. It doesn't just threaten your emotional well-being or your mental health. It threatens your very existence as an individual human being. When empathy becomes pathological, it doesn't just hurt you, it erases you. But Jung's case notes reveal one final crucial discovery that transforms this entire nightmare into something approaching wisdom. In the weeks following patient E's breakdown, Jung began developing what would become his most important therapeutic technique, the method of conscious empathic engagement, a way of maintaining empathic connection while preserving individual psychological boundaries. The technique of empathic sovereignty became Jung's solution to the empathy trap. He realized that the problem wasn't empathy itself, but unconscious empathy. Empathy without awareness, boundaries, or intentional control. Patient E had been absorbing others' emotional content unconsciously and automatically, with no ability to filter, process, or release what he was taking on. Jung developed a four-step protocol for what he called conscious empathy. First, awareness, recognizing when you're absorbing emotional content from others rather than experiencing your own emotions. This requires developing the ability to distinguish between internal and external psychological states, learning to identify when feelings aren't originating from your own experience. Second, boundaries, creating conscious barriers between your psychological space and others' psychological space. This doesn't mean becoming less compassionate, but rather becoming more intentional about when and how you allow others' emotions to affect you. Third, processing, actively working with absorbed emotional content rather than simply carrying it. This involves recognizing what belongs to others and consciously releasing it, while integrating any legitimate insights or growth opportunities that may have come from the empathic connection. Fourth, integration, using empathic experiences to deepen your understanding of human nature without losing your individual identity in the process. This means learning from others' psychological patterns while maintaining your own psychological integrity. Jung tested this protocol with other hyperempathic patients and found that it could prevent the kind of psychological dissolution that had destroyed patient E. People could maintain their empathic abilities while preserving their individual identity and psychological health. But the most remarkable part of Jung's discovery was what happened when he applied these techniques to patient E himself. In their final recorded interaction, Jung managed to help the man recognize that he still existed beneath all the absorbed psychological content. Through a process Jung called archaeological empathy, they were able to excavate patient E's original personality from beneath layers of foreign psychological material. The breakthrough came when Jung asked patient E to identify which emotions, memories, and psychological patterns actually belonged to him rather than to others. It was like asking someone to find their own reflection in a room full of mirrors, but slowly, painstakingly, they began to separate his authentic self from the accumulated psychological debris he had absorbed. This process revealed Jung's ultimate insight about empathy. It's not about feeling everything or understanding everyone. True empathy is about conscious connection, the ability to understand and connect with others while maintaining your own psychological integrity. It's empathy in service of relationship rather than empathy as psychological invasion. Patient E's recovery took years, but Jung documented his gradual return to psychological health through the disciplined practice of conscious empathy. The man learned to use his empathic abilities as a tool for understanding and connection rather than as an unconscious absorption mechanism. He became living proof that even extreme empathic sensitivity could be transformed from a curse into a gift through conscious awareness and intentional practice. The modern application of Jung's techniques is more relevant than ever. In our hyper-connected world, we all need to develop what Jung called empathic sovereignty, the ability to be compassionate and understanding without being overwhelmed or psychologically colonized by others' emotional content. This means learning to care without carrying, to understand without absorbing, to connect without losing yourself in others' psychological patterns. It means recognizing that true compassion serves others better when it comes from a place of psychological strength and clarity rather than from unconscious absorption and boundary dissolution. Jung's final words about patient E reveal the deepest truth about empathy. The most empathic thing you can do for another person is to remain yourself while understanding them. When you lose yourself in others' pain, you don't heal them. You just add your own dysfunction to theirs. The day patient E lost his mind wasn't the day he felt too much. It was the day he stopped being able to distinguish between his own feelings and everyone else's. The path back to sanity wasn't about feeling less, but about feeling more consciously, more intentionally, more sovereignly. Jung's case teaches us that empathy without boundaries isn't compassion, it's psychological suicide. But empathy with consciousness, with intention, with healthy boundaries, becomes one of the most powerful tools for human connection and healing that exists. As Jung wrote in his final notes on the case, "The empath who loses himself in others' pain heals no one. The empath who maintains himself while understanding others' pain can heal the world." Write in the comments, "I feel with boundaries, not without them." Share this with someone who needs to learn that compassion requires sovereignty, not sacrifice. And if you want to discover Jung's specific techniques for protecting yourself from psychic vampires while maintaining your empathic gifts, watch the next video where we explore the method that saved patient E's life.